Good evening. I'm Reynolds Verrett, president of Xavier University in Louisiana, one of the many institutions here in New Orleans. We are so happy to collaborate with the Jewish Federation in hosting this conversation, which for us will be a rich conversation on the questions of reparations, both in view of the past and of the present. And also it's about building a better future. But also as we do so, we will be modeling conversations about difficult topics in ways that should inspire both young and old. And it's a great joy to actually work with our brothers and sisters in New Orleans to see this great conversation come to pass and to have the speakers who will join us tonight to engage us in ways that we need to be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Verrett. My name is Bradley Bain, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Goldring Family Foundation Center for Jewish-Multicultural Affairs. The Center for Jewish-Multicultural Affairs is an in-house initiative of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans. Since 1913, the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans has served as the central address for our local Jewish agencies and faith-based organizations. On behalf of my co-chair, Ina Davis, our executive director, Aaron Block, and Federation CEO, Arnie Filko, we welcome you to this evening. The center has as its core mission fostering relations between our local Jewish community and our local African-American, Latinx, multi-faith communities, as well as enhancing opportunities for LGBTQ Jewish and non-Jewish community alike. We seek to build and maintain strong, mutually beneficial, and lasting partnerships. I don't want to take any time away from these important discussions on reparations. As Dr. Verrett mentioned, the history of German reparations following the Holocaust, and of course, the current call for slave reparations here in the United States. So allow me to provide just some brief introductions to our evening's panelists. First, Dr. Michael Berenbaum is a writer, lecturer, and teacher consulting in the conceptual development of museums and the historical development of films. He is the director of the Sigi Zierig Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He has served as the executive editor of the second edition of the now classical Encyclopedia Judaica. For 3 years, he was president and chief executive officer of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. Michael was was the project director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, overseeing its creation, and later directed its research institute and has developed museums across the globe. Our next guest, Tamara Fish, is the co-founder of Khazbar, an oasis for diverse Jewish community. Previously, she served as the president of the Jewish-Multiracial Network, president of Congregation Tehillah, and assistant director of the Office of the University Chaplain at Columbia. She has also served as faculty in the Religious Department of Manhattan College for 10 years. As an African-American Jew, Tamara is the author of Ahead of Yom Kippur, How Can You Repair Relationships with African-American Jews? And a member of both the Coalition for Diverse Harvard and Harvard Progressive Jewish Alumni. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Dr. V.P. Franklin, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education at the University of California, Riverside. He probably needs little introduction here, as I might also mention that he was a fellow at our own Midlow Center at the University of New Orleans. Dr. Franklin is the former editor of the Journal of African American History, the leading scholarly publication on African American life and history. Between 2009 and 2020, 5 articles published in this journal received national or international awards for his scholarly excellence in historical research. Dr. Franklin is the author or co-editor of 10 books, including the most recently published this year, Young Crusaders, The Untold Story of the Children and Teenagers Who Galvanized the Civil Rights Movement. Well, you all have heard enough from me. Let's get into the substance of our program, and let me turn the mic over to our first panelist, Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Dr. Berenbaum.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be with all of you today, an honor to speak with my fellow panelists. Let me talk as a historian and as a person who's just finished working on a documentary about what is called the Claims Conference. The Claims Conference is the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against the German Nation, which was established after a speech by Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, and who said essentially that Germany had to assume responsibility for its past. And part of that responsibility was to engage the Jewish community and to most particularly make some sort of reparations for the survivors. That set off an incredible debate within the Jewish community. And the debate within the Jewish community, the word was Wiedergutmachen, something that is going to make it good again, which is reparations. And the debate in the Jewish community was, how can we negotiate, how can we deal, how can we grapple with the German government and the German people so close to a period of time in which the Jewish community of Europe was annihilated? How can we put a price on our suffering, and how do we, in one sense, take and engage in blood money? The issue was so controversial that the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, would not engage it because he was a political leader who had a constituency and a deeply and profoundly divided nation about whether they should take these reparations. And consequently, the primary negotiation was left to a man who had an exalted title, but really no particular constituency. And that was Nachum Goldman, who was president of the World Jewish Congress. And frankly, nobody knows what the World Jewish Congress is. And it may be wise for nobody to know what the World Jewish Congress is, because it's not quite world and it's not quite Congress, but it seems to engage and represent Jewish institutions, claims to represent Jewish institutions throughout the globe. When they came to an agreement, it was so controversial in Israel that Menachem Begin, who later became prime minister, was then the opposition leader, stormed the Knesset, engaged in violence, and there was a feeling that what this reparations was going to offer for the German people was absolution. And the irony, of course, is that nobody wanted to offer absolution for what had happened. David Ben-Gurion had a terrible problem. And the problem was the pragmatic problem of a politician in leadership. He had to provide for a population that had literally doubled within the first year and a half of independence, with no known and serious economic provisions, and without the capacity to support the population that was coming in. Survivors of the Holocaust needed a haven, and then all of a sudden you also had the exile of Jews from Arab lands who were coming in. And consequently, he viewed it pragmatically as this was going to be a source of support. And he felt that as the head of state, as the leader of the country, he had to provide economically for his people food and basic necessities. And he was in favor of accepting the funds and accepting the gesture of Adenauer. That's the controversy of the 1950s. There also was a deep controversy that was immediately associated with it, which is the question is, who were victims of the Holocaust? And what were the diverse forms of victimization that took place? Were you in a concentration camp? Were you in a ghetto? Were you a refugee? Were you an escapee? And how much damage was done to you? And therefore, there were requirements at that point for medical examinations, psychiatric examinations, and many survivors regarded this as degrading. Let's move ahead 70 years, and we know that we're living in a situation in which there are less survivors, but survivors in greater need, and that is not necessarily in relationship to their survival, but it's in relationship to their age. And that is that if the average survivor was between 18 and 40 when they survived, The very young did not survive. The very old could not, as a general rule, endure. A 18-year-old kid is now 76 years later, is now 94. And the 40-year-old would have to be 116. And all we can say is there are the oldest known living survivor died about 2 months ago and was 109. So you could have to imagine the endurance. But let's move ahead 70 years. And let's say that and I'm speaking as a person who had a wonderful conversation today on an earlier Zoom with a wonderful writer, Katie Marton, who just did a biography of Angela Merkel. And Angela Merkel, what made Angela Merkel intriguing as a world leader, is she was the leader of Germany for 16 years. She also was the most private public person we know. For example, no one on her staff had ever been to her home. She did not socialize with politicians, but with writers and creative people and scientists. And poor Katie Marton had to write a public biography of a deeply private woman, did a wonderful job. But what came out was a very interesting thing that Angela Merkel feels, and Angela Merkel, remember, was born after the Holocaust, was born in Eastern Germany, did not have any particular personal responsibility for the Holocaust, but feels that Germany confronting its past is essential to it building its future as a democratic, pluralistic state that respects religious diversity, human rights, and human dignity. And her opposition to anti-Semitism is not so much because she loves Jews, it's because she hates a society in which such type of hatred could take place. And her support for Israel is part of what she regards as her responsibility as a German to the Jewish future. And her support for Israel, ironically, did not translate into support for Benjamin Netanyahu. She could easily distinguish between the state of Israel, the people of Israel, and the government of Israel. What have we learned from this about reparations? And I think these points are important for society. For the Germans, it gave them a way to join back into the human family and to essentially accept responsibility for the crimes committed by the German nation in the name of the German people, and a way of putting the past into the past, but in a responsible way that accepted responsibility and did not deal so much with all were not guilty, but all are responsible. And it gave them a path of building their future in a way, in a manner that reaffirmed the values that they wanted to create, which we would say were the anti-Nazi values of a society that respects diversity, pluralism, religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and also democratic norms. For the Israelis, ironically, it also was a way of rebuilding their future. And many survivors in the early 50s and the like needed support in order to rebuild their lives. And now what is happening with the type of support available for reparations is people who were denied dignity when they were young now have the capacity to live out into old age with as much dignity as possible. And old age, as my mother used to say, who lived into her mid-90s, old age is not for cowards, and it's not for the faint-hearted. But they're able to live out their life with as much dignity as is obtainable given their aging situation. And they feel that they are treated with respect and dignity. The result also is that 75 years later, Germany has the fastest growing Jewish community in the world. And it also has a Jewish community that is trying to isolate, I won't call them the neo-Nazi forces because they are really the Nazi forces, to contain them, to diminish their power, and not to go in the authoritarian direction that other European countries have moved in, most especially those from the East that were behind the Iron Curtain, who had a serious flirtation with democracy and now are moving toward authoritarian regimes, and also not to go into a situation of active populism that tries to turn the nation one against the other instead of move the nation and contain it one for the other. I'm going to leave it to my colleagues at this point to comment on its implications of this experience for what America should do with regard to our past of slavery. It's not that I don't have opinions. I do have strong opinions. It's that I feel that my first contribution should be apolitical and historical, to tell you what was involved and, as it were, the degree to which reparations helped the victim, and ironically, it helped the perpetrator, and it helped shape a German nation that is radically different than the German nation that existed 76 years ago. Let me conclude with that and turn it over to my distinguished colleagues.
First of all, Dr. Berenbaum, thank you so much for that presentation. It adds very different context than what we usually hear when we speak of reparations. And I would like to say thank you. Thank you for including me on this panel with such distinguished guests. And I will admit I enjoy being a bit of a provocateur. So I'm just going to come out and say the problem with reparations. That is the title of my talk. The problem with reparations. Problem with reparations is that we have a PR problem. We are hearing from distinguished historians. I am not a historian. I'm actually a biblical scholar. So I will leave the history to the people who do this constantly. As a biblical scholar, my expertise is in persuasion. Texts that are used to help people think about things in a new way. In religious traditions, we use sacred texts to move people to consider, to stretch beyond what they normally would. And what I would like to do then is to use my former recovering academe mode and speak to all of you out there with a different slant. How to use the materials and the history that you're going to receive now to talk with other people, not to talk to, but to talk with. Because when people mention reparations, generally what happens is that people already have their own idea. Reparations for slavery. Well, first of all, when we hear that term reparations for slavery, and we're speaking in the American context, that's over 400 years ago. Well, 150 to 400 years ago. It's very easy in an American world where we really don't do history well to say that doesn't matter. But if we change the angle and say, instead of reparations for slavery, reparation for the legacies of slavery, then that allows you to choose where the beginning of the conversation will be. You do not necessarily have to start with slavery when it started in the 1600s in this country. You can say the legacy traces out in a variety of ways, whether you choose the criminal justice and the ways in which race clearly slant who ends up in jail, who is able to get plea bargains, who is able to get legal services, what crimes Black people happen to be charged with, on the one hand, You can trace that out to educational systems. Now, I understand, Xavier, you're in the Big Easy. I'm in the Big Apple. And we in the Big Apple are full of liberals that like to talk about how fabulous we are and how progressive we are and the whole 9 yards. And why is it then that New York City has the most segregated school system, public school system in the country? What does it mean to be denied education? How did education play a role in American history in delimiting access to education for African Americans, right? Tether that with the role the federal government played in not just simply the GI Bill and restricting access of the GI Bill to African American soldiers, right? But how that traces out in access to the GI Bill to secure mortgages, that redlining was not something that was merely local, but was a federal policy dating back since 1936, I do believe, the underwriting of 36, that said that irreconcilable racial groups should not be put together in the same neighborhood. The legacies of slavery linger to this day. And so what you can do is flip the script so that we're not talking or starting with something that seems so long ago, but something that's contemporary, here and now. That will allow you pull on basic notions of fairness. One of the things that I and my partners at Khazbar have been able to do when we lead educational programs on reparations is to say to mixed audience, and by that I mean racially mixed audiences, call people into the discussion. Ask people whose families here have benefited from the GI Bill. Neighborhoods in which you lived, did the people around you benefit from the GI Bill? Who benefited from Social Security? For how many generations? How many people knew that access to Social Security was not guaranteed to all Americans, but for instance, was written primarily with this angle from Southern people in Congress, delimiting or excluding those that worked in agriculture and domestic services, which of course was 95% of African Americans at the time. And that minimum wage was also something that was developed around the same time that did not apply to people traditionally in service sectors, taking care of people, domestics, right? Once you can lay out how the legacies ripple to here and now, and ask people in the group to participate by asking, what are your stories? So it's not we are telling you, but we are talking with one another. Before you know it, you're halfway there to having people reconsider reparations as basic fairness and decency, and as something that calls all Americans to consider. It's also very interesting to hear people who maybe have come to the States recently and are learning for the first time, what? Really? These benefits were not extended to all Americans? When we call people into a discussion, to play with us, to learn from us, to bond together, we've changed the dynamic from an us, them to a we, and what can we do next? So I encourage each and every one of you, as you listen to the history and really extraordinary scholarship, truly cutting edge scholarship on reparations and history, think about what you can do with it in your community, to talk to your neighbors, to talk to people you don't talk to too much, to chat online and see if we can invite more people in to ask, at what price fairness? When and how long do we delay justice? And then we might get somewhere. Thank you very much. Look forward to the question and answer later.
Good evening, everyone. I am really happy to be able to participate in this discussion. And it's really, really important discussion that we're having this evening. And as a historian, I have been involved in trying to work with people to document the conditions and the situations that underlie these demands, reparations demands being made not just by people of African descent in the United States, but reparations demands being made by oppressed people in Africa, in the Caribbean, in South America, et cetera, who also can trace their depressed situation today back to a legacy of slavery, slave trading, and also legalized discrimination, where they were excluded from participation in the economy, they were excluded from areas of employment, et cetera, and education, et cetera. And on the basis of that legacy of exclusion, that exists currently, not just for African people in the United States, but in Africa and the Caribbean, et cetera, disparities between the housing conditions, the employment conditions, the educational background, the income between people who have been the result of discrimination, have been victimized by discrimination or racism, and the larger society. So that the legacy that Tamara has been asking us to pay attention to has created these disparities. And so what we're looking for are ways that we can develop reparations programs that would specifically target these disparities that exist between people of African descent in the United States and other parts of the world, and the larger majority population that was not victimized by these discriminatory and racially exclusionary practices over time, and that continues into the present day. And so as a historian, I've documented, I've done special issues on reparations campaigns among African Americans that began in the 19th century and then continued in the early 20th century, where they were interested, for example, for pension for formerly enslaved people. That is Mary Frances Berry, in her very important prize-winning book, My Face is Black, Carrie House and the Movement for Ex-Slave Reparations, which came out in 2005, documented that campaign by formerly enslaved African Americans who were asking for a pension, for support in their old age. This is the late 19th century and early 20th century. They were seeking a pension payment similar to the pensions that Civil War veterans were receiving, based on the income that the Southern states, acquired as a result of their unpaid labor. And so that was the early late 19th century, early 20th century. You had those demands to have reparations for those who were formerly enslaved, to provide them with some kind of pension support. And then one in the 1960s, you had Black Power demands and the situation where you had high rates of unemployment in cities around the country. And you had groups issuing a Black manifesto asking religious institutions Protestant, Catholic, Jewish religious institutions that may have benefited at some point from slavery and the slave trade to make amends, to provide funds to assist in Black economic development. So this was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, these reparations demand led by James Foreman, codified in the Black Manifesto, we documented that. We documented that campaign in the Journal of African American History and found that there was great opposition to the idea of the religious denominations, the various Protestant and Catholic religious denominations, providing funds to support Black economic development through the Black Manifesto, through the National Economic Conference that was making this demand. But what we were able to document is that although James Foreman and his organization that made that demand on these churches in 1969, 1970, 1971, that group did not get any kind of payment or reparations from these religious denominations. But what you had at the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s was the creation of Black caucuses and Black organizations within the Episcopal Church, within the Presbyterian Church, within the Congregationalist Church. These Black caucuses were created as part of the large movement for Black power and Black self-determination. And within those denominations, funds were made available to these Black caucuses within these church denominations, to support Black economic development projects in the 1970s. And so we do have some evidence that movement by these religious denominations assisted in the development of Black economic development projects in the 1970s as a result of the so-called Black Manifesto. And then you had the United States Congress agreeing in 1987 to provide reparations payments to Japanese Americans who had been interned during World War II, removed from their homes along the western coast, and then sent to these concentration camps, to these camps in various parts of the country during World War II. And then in 1988, there was a campaign to compensate those Japanese Americans who lost their homes and their businesses, et cetera, as a result of this movement, to compensate them in the form of $20,000. This is the US Congress granting these reparations payments to Japanese Americans as a result of their having been interned during World War II and lost property and land, and et cetera. And so that compensation for what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II then served as another example for African Americans who were interested in compensation for slavery, for Jim Crow, legalized racial segregation, et cetera, and led to the introduction by Congressman James Conyers of Detroit in 1988 of H.R. 40, House of Representative Bill 40, which was introduced by Congressman Conyers to provide for a commission that would be created to study the issue of providing reparations for African Americans, given the Congress's decision to provide reparations for Japanese Americans. And that piece of legislation was introduced in 88 and 89 and 90, et cetera. And it was introduced each time, but it never moved out of committee. And then we have the interest in reparations internationally coming to the fore in 2014 with the creation of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. This is the 15 Caribbean nations who came together and created the Caribbean community is known as CARICOM. And the CARICOM Reparations Committee was created by these 15 Caribbean nations who made reparations demands on the former colonial powers in Europe, primarily England, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, etc. And at the same time, these Caribbean nations then issued a 10-point program wherein they said how these reparations funds would be used. So you have the CARICOM Reparations Commission created in 2014, 2015, and then you had the creation of the 10-point program by CARICOM nations called that was explaining how they would use reparations funds from the former colonial powers to deal with the underdevelopment, in those nations is in the 50, 60 years since they achieved independence. The argument was that they were given their independence, but they were not compensated, they were not given the economic institutions and financing to support their nationhood. And so that so the CARICOM nations have made created this CARICOM Reparations Commission, and it is now in negotiation with these former colonial powers for that. And then on the basis of what the CARICOM nations had done, African Americans in the United States came together with the leaders of the CARICOM Reparations Commission in New York in 2015 and created the National African American Reparations Commission under the leadership of Dr. Ron Daniels, who is the president of the Institute for the Black World 21st Century. And the two came together in a summit. And as editor of the Journal of African American, I attended the summit, but I also had the photograph of the summit that took place between the African Americans and the Afro-Caribbean nations in 2015 on the cover of this special issue of the Journal of African American History in 2018. And so the National African American Reparations Commission is made up of individuals appointed who were professionals in different areas of the society. I've been on the commission, for example. But one of the activities of this commission was to update HR 40, update the bill that Congressman Conyers had been introducing each year, to not just call for the formation of a committee that would study the issue of reparations for African Americans, but would also come up with suggestions, ideas, strategies for implementing reparations for African Americans. And so that bill, some of you may have seen the hearings that were held in June of last year by the Judiciary Committee of the United States House of Representatives, where individual Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, who did the article in Atlantic in 2014 on the case for reparations, he testified, and various other Black political leaders testified before Congress in June of 2020 on this revised bill. And this revised HR 40, Sheila Jackson Lee, the Congresswoman from Houston, Texas, is now leading that campaign. And the bill has about 120 co-sponsors at this point, and it has been voted out of the Judiciary Committee, and it has to be called up by Nancy Pelosi for a vote at some point by the U.S. Congress. And so there's been this movement among African Americans and people of African descent in other parts of the world to try to get reparatory justice, that is to have the injustices that have been dealt to them over the centuries addressed through reparations payments of various forms, not just financial payment, but reparations in various forms, to deal with the disparities that currently exist as a result of the legacies of slavery, slave trading, legalized racial discrimination, not just in the United States, but in various other parts of the world. So this is where we stand, particularly in terms of the United States, in terms of HR 40 is in the US Congress and has been voted out of the Judiciary Committee. And you have the CARICOM Reparations Commission engaged in negotiation with the former colonial powers from the Caribbean. So I think I'll leave it there.
We have one question that's been asked in the Q&A part, and we're asking people to bring it into chat. The question that was asked, to summarize it essentially, is that one has to figure out what is the proximate nature of the injury in order to figure out what the proximate nature of the reparations might be. I'm paraphrasing it, but let me suggest something. Stuart Eisenstadt, who was the ambassador of the United States on the issue of not of reparations, but essentially of property that was seized during the Holocaust to be returned to the Jewish community, entitled his book "Imperfect Justice." And that is, it is not an adjudicating of one case in which you can say, I lost the use of my limb and that has a certain type of thing. I suffered the following and that has another thing. We're talking about a combination of imperfect justice and symbolic justice. Throughout the Holocaust and in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, you did not get full justice. Full justice is impossible in the aftermath of an atrocity. How do we account to what we've robbed the human being of over a long period of time? And how do we account to that a generation, 2 generations later? So you have to accept that there is an imperfect justice, a symbolic justice. And also I want to focus in a very real way not only on the way in which this type of action benefits the victim, but also allows the perpetrator a way to come back, as it were, from a crime that has been committed for which repair is required. And that, I think, has to be a very important focus. In other words, white folks like me can benefit from this. And if it's that way, then one can think differently about what's required as well. And I know some are going to criticize it because why the hell should we benefit? But the reality is that the act of repair benefits both the person who has been damaged and the person who makes the gesture with regard to repair.
I think that that's a very important point. For example, I was recently in France, and while I was there, a report was issued by an investigator about abuse, about sexual abuse, et cetera, that had occurred in the French Catholic Church between, in the 20th century, like from the 1940s through the 1980s. And it was a very, very important report. And it indicated that there were, they counted like 300,000 cases of abuse in of young people, people by individuals associated with the officials associated with the Roman Catholic Church. And that was just released, while I was in France. In fact, they came up and I saw it. And the way that they describe what should happen to those people who were abused and have been identified was in terms of reparations. This is the phrase that they use, that Roman Catholic Church should pay reparations to those who were victimized, that have been identified and have been victimized by abuse, sexual abuse by members of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, if the Roman Catholic Church is to think of itself as a moral institution, think of itself as something that people should look to, that should respect, should honor, etc., then they should act on this. They need to act on the results of this report, the information that's on this report. Because otherwise the moral leadership, any kind of moral leadership of the French Catholic Church, and it's been tenuous for a while, but it is on even shakier grounds if they do not attempt to deal with the people who were abused by the church, by the Roman Catholic Church, and they did not do anything to try to prevent it or help them or something like that. So that the idea that the people who have been charged and the people that reparations demands are made against, their moral authority, their position saying that they are the leader of whatever in the world, is with question if they do not address what has been revealed about their failures, about the way that the institution operated, the abuse, the oppression, et cetera, that it had carried out over a long periods of time. So yes, this has to be done if they are to restore their reputation. We want to repair the damage, but they need to restore their reputation.
And one more thing they need to do, which is to examine the system that allowed this to be perpetrated over a very long period of time.
Yes.
And that is a critical step, because you have to foreclose the future damage as you confront making some sort of gesture to grapple with the damage that's already been done.
Yes.
And I want to come back to my initial point on this. Look, let's take the case of sexual abuse. And we also should say that there was a great deal of sexual abuse during slavery as well. Sexual abuse does not only impact the victim, but impacts the way in which the victim deals with their children, and even the way in which they deal with their grandchildren. So this ends up having multi-generational consequences with regard to that deed, in the same way that we see that trauma becomes transmitted through generations. So you're looking, there's no way to come to an equitable solution. There is a way to come to a symbolic solution, a restitutional solution, an imperfect solution, and accept the fact that we are frail human beings whose very nature is imperfect.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said, but I would like to take a look at the two examples and contrast where America stands. American history poses a different problem. The Holocaust. Everyone has agreed that that atrocity was wrong, amoral, horrific. Sexual abuse, likewise, and within the last 20 years, finally, people have been able to accept and hear that the Catholic Church, clergy in the Catholic Church, perpetuated sexual abuse. Now, where I find the American situation that's a little bit different is that only recently does there seem to be a groundswell and an acceptance of the myriad of ways that African Americans have been excluded, the systematic racism, right, that has been a hallmark of American history since the beginning. And only recently are we seeing, once again, since the civil rights movement, let's say, a reckoning with history itself. Now, how long will it take? Maybe that's not even the right question, but it seems to me that some sense of acceptance of the historical realities must become part of the American consciousness, that it's not just African American.
Look, let me. Tamara, you are muted.
You're muted.
Please, you're muted. So
Merciful God, let me make this quick.
No,
let me make this quite quick.
No, you came back.
Okay.
You've come back now, but tell us what. Well, you don't know when you were muted, but make your point one more time.
The last 20 seconds.
And
fantastic.
By the way,
then
I would bet from our brief contact that you're not very often told that you're muted.
Quite true. So, in the two prior cases of the Holocaust as well as clergy abuse within the Catholic Church, with the Holocaust, it took a while for people to acknowledge the horrificness, the crimes of the Holocaust. It took a while for people to accept that, my goodness, clergy in the Catholic Church perpetuated sexual abuse. In our American context, we are still beginning to explore the ways that systematic racism was perpetuated at governmental levels historically. And it seems to me that we have to, as a people, accept that reality in order for there to be repair. Now, that's where I'm stuck. Am I wrong in my assumption that there is still a lot that we as American culture must absorb about the myriad of ways that Black people have been written out of our history?
Look, I wish I could say you're wrong. You may be more right than you expect. Let's take two very simple examples. There is a concerted effort now on the issue of voting rights. And the concerted effort targets segments of the population. We're now not only targeting African Americans, but we're targeting Hispanics, and we're targeting other groups, and we're targeting immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. But the voting rights bill is designed to make sure that certain imbalances in power are maintained. The second example is we have, and I wish we did a better job of it. I wish people who are criticizing critical race theory are asked very basically, what is critical race theory? And can give me 3 examples of schools that have been teaching critical race theory. But the idea, and the press fails its job in the same way it fails its job when it says, somebody says this is socialism, and they don't ask the person, what do you mean by socialism, and what does that represent? But if we take the very simple example of the refusal to grapple with the idea that there may be, quotation marks, critical race theory, that racism is embedded in some of the laws and some of the traditions of the United States of America, and that becomes a polarizing figure that empowers people to talk about that and rabble-rouse against it, then we have a very long way to go. And we have to pay attention to how long a way we have to go. And what I'm finding in my research now is that there used to be a time when people were ashamed to admit racism, and were ashamed to admit anti-Semitism. And now we have a situation in which people feel able to admit both, fueled by the internet, which gives them a megaphone, and mutually supported by the social support networks. And the expression of such hatred is regarded as authentic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying it like it is. And there's a great deal of support for that. And that's one of the problems we have in the society in which we live. And it's one of the reasons that we have to confront hatred in all of its manifestations.
Yeah, and it's a situation where certain individuals benefit from putting forth these kinds of doctrines, and and dividing dividing up the society, and most importantly, creating scapegoats for deficiencies and problems that people may have in their lives, and so that they're saying that the reason why you may be underemployed, or the reason why your child didn't get into this school is because they gave it to this immigrant, they gave it to this Black person, et cetera. And so, and if you elect me to office, I'll see that no longer happens. So that there are individuals who are perpetrating these doctrines, they're whipping people up into a frenzy about a topic. They're lying to them about critical race theory. The critical race theory is not taught in elementary schools, And as an African American, as a historian of the African American experience, what this looks like is that they want to remove discussion of African American history and culture from the schools, from the curriculum, after all of these decades of struggle to get that material in the schools, because it is an important part of our history. And it also explains certain changes, et cetera, that exist in our society, and things that all Americans benefit from as a result of what African Americans had to experience and had to go through in order to gain the rights that they thought they had, but have to mobilize to try to maintain them. So African Americans are really disturbed by this, because we fought this battle before. We fought this battle in the 1960s and the 1970s, 1960s to get Black history courses in elementary school, in high school, and then on college campuses with the movement for Black studies programs, and we know what happened. We had Chicano studies program, Jewish studies programs, women's studies program. So it was as a result of African Americans making that move that the programs available in the university changed, have advanced, have expanded, have become more democratic as a result of what African Americans had to struggle to try to obtain as a result of movement in the 1960s and 1970s. And so what we see in terms of this attack on so-called critical race theory really is an attempt to remove these topics and issues from the curriculum, from a discussion in the curriculum that have been documented by historians and scholars, but they now want to remove that from the curriculum because that campaign will benefit them politically, and they will benefit them financially.
By the way, I can testify for the accuracy of the way in which Black studies let in Jewish studies, and a little bit later on women's studies. When I was a very young man, the only place you could imagine teaching Judaism was if you worked in a synagogue and you became a rabbi. And I am among the first generation. I'm a little bit younger than that, but I know the first generation that ended up being able to go into the university, all of which was a result of the opening of American society to diverse voices and diverse experiences that occurred at the tail end of the 60s. And we were a tremendous beneficiary of it. And not only were we a beneficiary of it, but I have to say the students were a beneficiary of it, because they then heard not only a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male tradition as they read literature, but they heard such terrible voices as Toni Morrison. They read such miserable philosophers as Maimonides and Saadia Gaon. They understood that there was a Hebrew Bible and not an Old Testament that had nothing to say in the New World. We understood that the world was not completely male. And all of a sudden, our world broadened in an extraordinary way. The difference, and you and I are more or less of the same generation, the difference is we had an optimism about what America could welcome and be open to. And we are living at a time, despite the fact that the United States elected an African American to be president of the United States, we're living at a time in which we feel that we are going backwards. And I wonder if this is not, again, the transformation that occurred in the aftermath of the Civil War, when Reconstructionism was stopped and a new atmosphere occurred in the land. And consequently, we had a dramatic transition in where we were spiritually, morally, and in terms of a four-letter word that's very important, hope.
Yes, well, as a historian of the African-American experience, these 2 steps forward, 2 steps back kinds of pattern, because you have these advancements for African Americans, and then you have the backlash. You have the backlash against these advancements. And that has been, so as you say, you had the backlash following Reconstruction. You had the backlash in the 1920s with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan after the war. African Americans participated in World War I. They expected to get some kind of rights out of their participation in the war. And you had a backlash against this new Negro movement of the 1920s with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, marching thousands, parading down Washington main streets in Washington, D.C. in the 1920s. And so you had a backlash there and stuff. And then, of course, we know about the civil rights movement and the advances, the laws that were passed, the advancements that were made, and the backlash that has occurred that seems to be continuing and getting worse in this early 21st century. And what has been an important aspect of what African Americans have been trying to achieve is an understanding that African Americans are citizens, they help make this country, and that what history tells us is that the advances that African Americans try to make in American society benefits the entire society ultimately. The entire society benefits from trying to address these disparities, the discrimination that African Americans face in the society. And that is the message that we should be broadcasting, and it's being snuffed out by these attacks on so-called critical race theory.
Picking up on that thread of sometimes, as our Catholic friends say, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. There's a commenter who seized on, I believe, making reference to a veiled reference to another Catholic university, Georgetown, right? In trying to move that one step forward, in trying to find one way of doing reparations. And so Talia Ford writes, let me see if using the idea of starting a conversation about reparations contemporarily, is it enough for educational institutions, like predominantly white institutions, to issue full ride scholarship or partial tuition scholarship to African American students as an initial effort of reparations and bridging an educational divide? I find that question particularly insightful because it gets down to the nitty-gritty. How do we do reparations? In the case of educational institutions, please take it away.
I want to deal with one. I want to deal with one word of that. Excuse me. I want to deal with one word of that. When you ask, is it enough? That's the wrong question. The most important, because enough is a different story. I think we have to ask, is it good? Is it useful? Is it important? Is it symbolically important that such scholarships be offered? Is it better than the current situation? And progress is incremental, and progress is has to be done step by step. So if you're asking, is it enough, you're making the people who have made the initial gesture feel bad about the gesture because it clearly is not sufficient. But if you're asking, is it good, is it important, is it symbolically useful, then I think you're asking a different question, and that you can answer wholeheartedly yes. The other point I wanted to make to Dr. Franklin is I always say about anti-Semitism what you can say about racism, that history has taught us it's a whack-a-mole. You solve one problem and it pops up elsewhere. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't solve the one problem. It just means that you have to continually fight against it in order to achieve substantial progress.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I've worked with, let's put it this way, I'm in Louisiana, and the people who were the enslaved people who were sold in order to pay off the debts of Georgetown University ended up in Louisiana, okay? And I have worked with with that group here, and what was revealed when we identified these descendants of those who were sold is that they were impoverished. They were impoverished in southwestern Louisiana, and that the idea of providing them with scholarships either to attend Georgetown or to attend was a very positive thing to do, because they were still impoverished. Like 150 years later, these people were still impoverished when we identified the actual descendants. And I want to say also that the students at Georgetown University recognized that. And they voted to put aside part of their fees, of their university fees, to put into a fund that would be used to provide scholarships and other programs for these descendants of those who had been enslaved and sold to support Georgetown University. And they viewed this, the students voted to do this, and the university at first was, taken aback. But again, to your point about the symbolism of it, they recognized that they wanted to take a position. The students at Georgetown University wanted to take a position on this to support, to demonstrate that they felt that this was a wrong that the university engaged in, and they were willing to engage, to participate in the repair. I guess, it's the idea of Georgetown having a bad reputation, okay, as a result of, of all of this being exposed, and the students themselves saying, no, we want to try to repair this situation. We want to do something about it, and we will put demands. We will pay. We are willing to pay part of our tuition to support a campaign that will try to rectify this situation.
I love the notion of repair. We did an exhibition in Dallas on what we call Pivot to America in a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, in which we said, embrace ideals, challenge reality, participate in repair. That one of the important capacities of the American system is that you can challenge reality and you can participate in repair. We have a responsibility to challenge rather than to accept reality. And we all have a responsibility to participate in repair, which is to make ourselves better. Not ideal, not sufficient, not enough, but still very, very important. Let me ask one question that's come up. Somebody asked, what guidance would you give K through 12 educators who with regard to teaching effectively critical race theory? And I have an answer, but I want to hear your answers first.
I think that the teachers should be teaching what is in the curriculum now, because what is actually in the curriculum now. That is, you do have African American history and culture included in the curriculum now. And there's in the past, before the civil rights era, in the era of Jim Crow legal, and when Black education was overseen by Southern administrators, for example, we know that Black teachers in these schools passed on African American history and cultural resistance in their classrooms. And although that was not in the regular curriculum, these teachers, and we have the evidence, this is something that you can document historically, we have the evidence that these teachers put it in the curriculum because it was not given to them. And so you had a situation where and what I document in the 1960s and 1970s in my book, The Young Crusaders, I document the students demanding the inclusion of Black history in the regular curriculum. So it was not just the so we say militants or those activists who were demanding the inclusion of African American history and culture in the regular US American history courses and social studies curriculum. It was the students. It was the students themselves. They marched and boycotted and protested, demanded that this be included because they felt that the American history that was being propagated and given to them was incomplete. There were absences. There was missing information. And so as a result, we have that now. A lot of that has been introduced and included in the curriculum. And what we have now is a situation where many teachers may have to engage in what one of my colleagues calls fugitive pedagogy and include African American history and culture, or the history of Chicano Americans and the history of women and other groups in their courses sub rosa, and not in order not to come up against those who are opposing what they feel is critical race theory in American public schools. It's not there, but at the same time, that's what they're what they're looking for and what they're charging.
I would say we get to critical race theory much later in education. I'd rather we begin with very important basics.
Right.
And that basic must include the variety of histories involved. And also, very importantly, I think that we have to develop heroes that come out of this experience and models that come out of this experience. I just was reading to my grandchildren the value of courage that came with Jackie Robinson's story. And very important that an African-American embodies courage, that a woman embodies strength, that we can teach values through heroism and through decency of extraordinary people all the way through.
And our children and young people will benefit from that.
No question about it.
Beautiful. There's another question in the chat, and it's a really interesting question because it asks us to think about systemic racism and how it works. The question is from Chinny Parker. With segregation being implemented in many ways, education, public transportation, housing, do you believe redlining is a tactic used not only to refuse those, not only to certain neighborhoods, but to a discriminatory practice to keep Blacks and African Americans from seeking any kind of growth, financial, seeking better opportunities? Okay, so I'm understanding that question as the use of redlining to not only preserve a neighborhood, but to de facto to inhibit African Americans, Blacks from having any opportunity. Historians, what are your thoughts on that matter?
Well, the redlining was carried out by supported by the federal government and its loan and the federal mortgage loan agencies and institutions, so that they said, telling the banks and the mortgage companies, do not offer loans in this particular area or to these people who may disrupt the quality, the ambiance, et cetera, in a particular area. So it was a regulation. Keep in mind, it was a regulation promulgated by the Federal Home Mortgage Association, and so this was GI loans, this was GI Bill loans, housing loans, as well as the FDIC, and et cetera, telling the banks not to, and they would put a red line around a particular neighborhood and say either this, do not provide loans for individuals interested in moving into this area, or do not provide loans to people who will disrupt or undermine the property values that exist in this particular neighborhood. So it was enforced. It was enforced by the government, and African Americans could not get loans. And one of the strangest things about this is that when white flight occurred, that is, you had real estate agents that targeted a particular neighborhood to sell homes in this neighborhood to African Americans at inflated prices. And so they show up at a white homeowner's door and say, oh yeah, you know what's going to happen, they're moving in your neighborhood, but I'm going to buy your house so that you can move to the suburbs, et cetera. But I'm going to have to pay you a very low amount because
property rates are going down.
Property rates are going down, right? Exactly. And then they sell the house to the Black home purchaser at an inflated price, And in some cases, as has been documented in Chicago and Philadelphia and various other places, they actually sold when the Black family could not make a large down payment, on these homes. They sold these homes on the installment plan.
That's right. Yeah.
And the Black family had to pay monthly the installment in order to eventually purchase their home. But the problem with the way that this operated was that if they at any time did not pay that installment, then the owner, the real estate agent or the real estate company or the owner would then evict them from the home, sell it to another African-American family at an inflated price on the installment plan. So it was very exploitative. It was a very exploitative practice that existed that piggybacked on the redlining that was occurring through the banks not providing regular loans for African Americans interested in purchasing homes.
Let me add to that. I think that we have to look also at the shape of what's about to come down. We now have a dramatic increase in the amount of infrastructure that's going to be built. And infrastructure is essential to the development of societies. And the very interesting question is going to be, where are they going to build the rail services? Where are they going to build the public transportation? What neighborhoods are going to be included? What neighborhoods are going to be excluded? I taught at Georgetown University for the better part of 20 years. And the very intriguing thing was that the metro did not stop in Georgetown, because the metro was going to have all Washingtonians participate, and the real estate interests of Georgetown, and not the university, but the segment of Washington, D.C., which is a high-end neighborhood, did not want all sorts of people walking through their neighborhood. As the metro developed and developed very well, they bemoaned the fact that there was not a stop in Georgetown. But as we're building infrastructure, where are they going to replace the bridges? Look what happened to whole ranges of neighborhoods when the interstates were built in all sorts of ways. And redlining is one of the aspects of shattering and changing neighborhoods' context. All of the infrastructure that's about to be built has real societal implications for the way in which we live a life, for the way in which neighborhoods prosper, for the way in which living patterns develop. And all of that is going to shape, with this great investment, all of that is going to shape what we're going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from today. So let's look at redlining as one problem. This larger problem with the infusion of $1 trillion offers opportunities and offers perils.
Yeah, well, I'm here in New Orleans, we know that the building of the Highway 10 went through the Black neighborhood on Claiborne Avenue and all of that, and this disrupted that community, and that was because one reason was because of a lack of political power and influence on the part of the African American community. They couldn't determine where the highway was going. They had no input in determining where this infrastructure, where the highway would be built. They said let's build it in the Black neighborhood. It's sort of like with environmental racism. Let's build a toxic plant in the neighborhood for poor people, Black people, et cetera. But we're in a situation with, as you mentioned, with this new infrastructure funds coming down. We have to make sure that the political leaders are held accountable for how these funds are used and who benefits from it. The problem is of course, is the money in the US political system. And the only way that the people really can counter the money is going to, those with money, they talk, money talks, they talk, et cetera. And the only way that the people are going to be able to try to hold these political leaders accountable is by mobilizing their neighborhoods, their organizations, their churches, et cetera, to make sure that the infrastructure benefits their neighborhoods, their communities, and not just those who have contributed large amounts to the political campaigns of the politicians in that particular locale. And so you have to recognize that we can't influence it by money. You can't compete with the amount of money that is being donated by these wealthy people to make sure that they get their way out, get what they want out of the political system. But we have to mobilize. The people have to mobilize and demonstrate that they won't tolerate the sacrificing of their interests, and their community and their benefits by these political leaders who will be making the decisions about how these infrastructure funds will be expended.
Well, I think this has been a stimulating and interesting conversation. I think we've just begun. And I salute our hosts for inviting us. And I have thoroughly enjoyed the past 90 minutes.
Thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed it as well.
I hope the audience did as well.
No, I did. I learned a lot.
This has been extraordinary, and the best part about Zoom is that we feel like we're in each other's living rooms just having a good chat. I'd like to do this again.
Well, that's a cue, Tamara, for me to jump in if it's okay. My name is Arnie Filko. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Orleans. And I, first of all, want to thank Dr. Verrett from Xavier University and all of the students and faculty and staff from Xavier that participated tonight, one of our country's great institutions. I also want to thank Bradley Bain, who started the evening. Bradley is the co-chair of the Goldring Center that's putting this event on tonight. And of course, I want to thank our three speakers. You were brilliant. This is a difficult, challenging topic, and you handled it so well and provided so much information to all of us. And as I was reading the chats and the great questions that were asked tonight, I think one of the overriding topics of the evening is how do we take this wonderful discussion and the history and the education from this evening and translate it into action and public policy. And again, I hope that we can bring all of you back. I hope that we can continue to tackle this really important topic. I think it's important not only for our country, but I think it's important for our country to come back again in a way that we would all be proud of, as opposed to the divisiveness that we see each and every night and day in our media. So to all of you, thank you for joining us. Thank you, by the way, to Dillard University and its students, and SUNO and Xavier, our three HBCU partners. Tonight is the last night of the 2021 HBCU series, but you can be assured that come 2022, the Jewish Federation and the Goldring Center will be back at the table with more programming at each of the three universities. I wish all of you a wonderful evening, a meaningful and safe and happy Thanksgiving, and we look forward to seeing you after the new year. Have a great evening, everyone.